Well, in this clip, I'll try to give you an overview of the development of our capitalist world economy. There's a lot of ground to cover. Can only point out to some of the highlights. Immanuel Wallerstein himself wrote 4 volumes about it, and he didn't really cover it all. It's like I did bring it with me, but it's like a stack of 4 bulky volumes totaling like 1,500 pages or something like that. A little bit less, but still very much to cover. Well, let's start. Before the world system, before the capitalist world economy emerged, there were world systems. These maps try to show what these world systems are. There was one which was more or less a world empire, but perhaps also world economy, at least probably a world empire based on China and covering the South China Sea. We heard that one before, and we heard about the South China Sea later. And these others, there was a trade basin in the Indian Ocean. There was a trade, a world economy to some extent, and there was a world economy to some extent, at least emerging. There were trade relations in the Mediterranean and in northwestern Europe. These were not part really of a world system because the relations were not important enough for that. That changed in the late Middle Ages, or better to say after the late Middle Ages. What was the situation in Europe? It's a map of Europe. There was a core in northern Italy, the Italian towns, the Renaissance towns, as we know them, Venice, for instance. And they had and there was a core in today's Flanders. It's now part of Belgium. And these 2 cores, they organized more or less, or their own trade circuits, perhaps their own world economies, but they were not strong enough to be really a world economy. But there were at least trade links organized by the North Italian states in the Mediterranean basin. And let's call it the Hanseatic network, which very much focused on Flanders, and that was in the North Sea and Baltic Sea area. And when the world system emerged, according to Wallerstein, what he called the long 16th century, between roughly 1450 and 1650, all these relations really intensified. First of all, they intensified, and that had to do with the expansion. These arrows indicate that expansion to the new world, the age of the exploration, the incorporation, the colonization of at least part of the Americas. And it really changed the whole system, or created the system. It made the northwestern part, first of all Flanders, later on the Netherlands, and even more later on southeast England, made it into the core of the capitalist world economy. And that was based on these new external links, but also on the intensification, perhaps at least as important, of the trade in the Baltic. I'll come to that later. The grain trade, the mother trade, the Dutch called it, the moedernegotie. While on the other hand, the core in northern Italy declined. Those North Italian towns, they became less important. They became more or less subjugated through the trade links. The trade links with northwestern Europe became more unfavorable to them. For instance, financials, the debts controlled by northwestern Europe really made a lot of influence in the Mediterranean. What's new? And also the trades in Mediterranean was partly taken over in the end by the Dutch. So that is the first way to look at the emergence of the capitalist world economy, of the modern world system. And that resulted more or less in a core area already discussed in northwestern Europe, a semi-periphery in between, and the periphery which was really exploited, the new colonies and Eastern Europe and Ireland. What was the difference between those areas? Let's take first of all a look at the situation in Eastern Europe. That was the time when capitalism emerged. The capitalism, we know that's a system of freedom. In the Netherlands, freedom increased, but at the same time, there was a decrease in freedom for the laborers in large part of Eastern Europe. They call that the second serfdom. And that meant that the peasants were tied more strictly through force on the land, and they had to produce. They were enslaved to some extent to those new feudal landlords who were really capitalists, also really involved in capitalism. They were financed partly by MS, Amsterdam merchants, and they made a huge profit by exporting grain. Really a new, more powerful relation emerged. So that is the periphery. And on the other hand, we have the core in Amsterdam and at the end of the long 16th century and the mid 17th century in our, you can also call it the mid 17th century, because it was more or less, Amsterdam became really the core of the core in northwestern Europe. A huge town, very much the staple market for all types of products. And that was made possible, really physically made possible by the grain trade. The Amsterdam, more than half of the population, if you calculate it, and the historians are very good in calculating that stuff. They really depended on the foods imported from the periphery, imported and thus produced by those large estates in Eastern Europe, controlled by that second serfdom. So the integrated system, really strong relations. It was also those relations became strong because of transport innovations. The Dutch designed or evolved a new system, the fluit, the new type of ship, which was very efficient in transportation. You needed very few hands to transport a lot of goods. So it became cheaper and therefore relations intensified. But this was not only about economics. The Dutch sea power, of course, was very important. We come to discuss that in some other time, and it's also discussed by Flint and Taylor. So it's based on this interrelation between those, the merchant fleet and the naval power. That's a clear relation. Mahan already discussed that before. So that's also an important reason, an important aspect of that core position of in this case, the Netherlands in that emerging capitalist world economy. But it was also involved a lot of other stuff. For instance, the Zaanstreek to the northwest of Amsterdam was full with windmills, and it was full of shipyards and another type of industry. It was really, one can argue, the first industrial region in the world, which imported trees from the Baltic area, and tar, for instance, from Finland, and the laborers who to some extent came were migrants from Germany. They were fed by the grain from the Baltic. So there is already a core periphery structure emerging. You already read about it. But the importance is that at that time those differences were small. When you look at data on, for instance, income, the nutrition value, the difference between those serfs, those enslaved people in the periphery or on the plantations in the Americas, and the workers in the Netherlands who were free, who were earning a wage. Well, there were differences, but they were not that huge. And that's a general point, that there's differences over time just increased. That's here you see the figure, but also which is depicted also that I took from Flint and Taylor, and it had to do with feedback mechanisms. It's about specialization. The Dutch, in the Netherlands, I'll keep to that example. They were able to specialize. And that's a key characteristic of the core, that the core production is specialized, while in the periphery it's very much more focused on very limited sectors. And there's specialization in the core and specialization in the most profitable types of economic activities. So basically there are two feedback loops. There's a negative feedback loop in the periphery, and a positive feedback loop in the core. So very small initiatives have huge consequences. Well, there was also at that time that there was an external arena. There was the modern world system didn't cover the whole world. There was, I already showed you the map. Asia and Africa were, according to Wallerstein, and there's strong arguments for that. They were outside that modern world system. They didn't produce goods which were essential. Discussion what is essential. They were not essential for the functioning of the world economy. For instance, the goods produced for Asia, which were very profitable, the VOC, people who invested in that earned a lot of money from that. That stuff was not really, I can argue, fundamental for the operation of the economy in Northwestern Europe. But another argument Wallerstein uses is that it was not produced for the market. It was not the production in Asia was not regulated by the markets in Europe, although others dispute that to some extent. But an important point is that the Chinese were then in control of production and of the trade. And the Europeans, they had to pay heavily. They had to pay in silver, and that silver was then used politically by the Chinese to buying off the Mongolian hordes, who were had a silver appetite, and you paid them a lot of silver. Those Mongolian hordes here in the steppes in Central Asia, they would be deterred from invading China, which happened a lot of times. So we have still a lot of areas outside the world system, and I showed you this slide before, and that is, of course, there are arguments for that and the arguments against it, and how you evaluate them, that depends on your the criteria you use.